Hello, my name is Nina, and my story is about the time my father passed away. I expected it to be sad, of course, but what I hadn't expected was that my father had left me with a huge family secret that would flip my world upside down. I know my father will seem like the bad guy here, but try not to judge him before you hear what really happened from the start. Growing up, it was always just me and my father. My mother passed away when I was only 2 years old, so my father raised me by himself. However, when I was around 15 years old, my father fell ill, and as I grew older, he wasn't able to leave his bed much. It made me feel so depressed. That time in my life was extremely difficult, especially because I didn't know how to handle it. The tension between my father and I got incredibly intense because we knew that he would shortly pass away. During that time, I started asking him all kinds of questions about our family, things that we had never really discussed. You see, I had no one but my father. No extended family, and I always wondered why my grandparents hadn't had any more children. I always hated that he never really answered the questions I had when I looked at his old family photos, especially when I wanted to know who the little girl in the photos was. She was there in every single one. One time, he told me that it was their neighbor's daughter that they had to take care of after her parents passed away. And when I asked him about her a while after, he said that she was his cousin that died at a young age. His story was never consistent, and he would forget the lie that he had told me every time. That's how I knew something was up. And when I confronted him, he got angry and said that it was none of my business. Later that day, I saw him crying alone in his room. After a while, I decided to let it go. My questions had caused him pain and anger, and he already had enough on his plate. Around the time I was 18, my father passed away. I knew the day was coming. We had many conversations about what would change after he was gone, but it still hit me hard knowing that he wouldn't be there anymore. On the day of his funeral, I was surprised by how many people showed up because we didn't really know a lot of people. They were mostly my father's acquaintances that he'd made while he was in the hospital, and the neighbors that lived around us. They couldn't really be called friends, as none of them had known him that well, but it was kind of them to pay their respects. That day, I walked around shaking hands, receiving hugs, and thanking everybody for coming before it was time for them to leave. At the end of the day, my father was gone, and I was all alone. A couple of months after the funeral, I was finally ready to move on. I was about to start college and was excited to start a new chapter in my life. Every week since he had passed away, I made a trip to his grave to replace the flowers on his tombstone and to have a little talk with him. I would tell him about all of my problems and think about the way that he would respond if he was there with me. After a while, it became a routine that I looked forward to. That was until one particular day when something weird happened that changed everything I had ever known about my father. I began noticing that someone was leaving weird-looking flowers at my father's grave about once a week. At first, I didn't give it much thought, but with time, I got curious. Every time it would be black roses and thistles. I found it strange and a bit disrespectful. Who would leave such a thing on someone's grave? The longer it kept happening, the more annoyed I got, until one time, the person who was leaving black roses and thistles on my father's grave revealed herself. One day, as I was walking towards my father's grave, I noticed a woman walking away. She looked like a nice person, so I figured she might have just been walking by. But once I got closer to my father's grave, I noticed something odd. The black roses and thistles on his tombstone were fresh, and beside them, I noticed that something was carved onto the stone. It said, "I will never forgive you." I was really confused. All kinds of thoughts were running through my head when the groundskeeper passed by. I walked up to him and asked about the woman. I asked him if he knew anything about her. He told me that she'd been coming for a while now, once a week around the same time. I couldn't believe that we had never crossed paths, but even more, I needed to know who she was. I'd never seen her before, so I knew she wasn't a local. And how had she known my dad? With my curiosity piqued, I decided to see if she would come back the next week on the same day. When the day finally came, I drove up to the cemetery and waited for most of the day. The hours passed by, and I was starting to think she wasn't going to come. However, a couple of minutes later, there she was. It was time to get the answers that I'd been wanting for a week. I tapped her on her shoulder, and she turned around. At first, her face was filled with shock, but it quickly turned to joy. I was creeped out. "Excuse me, I'm Nina. Can you tell me your name?" But then she took my hand in hers. "I know who you are, Nina. I'm Kim." She looked at me deeply. "It's so nice to see you in person," she said, staring at me with fondness in her eyes. "Wow, you're certainly their spitting image." I started to panic. Who was she? And how did she know my name? I tried to stay calm and said nervously that my father thought I looked more like my grandma. She just chuckled and said, "Yeah, that's who I was talking about." "You knew my grandma?" "Of course I did," she said, still smiling. "I mean, she was my mother too, after all." She reached into her pockets again and pulled out a wallet. When she opened it, there was a picture of her, my dad, and their parents standing in front of a church. Seconds must have turned into minutes, but I was just too shocked to speak. So she broke the silence first. "I didn't mean to scare you. If you want, we could walk up to the diner across the street and I'll answer anything that you want." I was scared, but I needed answers, so I agreed. We sat in the back of the diner, away from the noise. Sitting across from her in the diner, a lot of questions ran through my mind. My hands started to fidget nervously while I tried to process all of the thoughts in my head. In the end, it was no use in trying, and I just blurted out the first thing on my mind. "Are you like my aunt?" She nodded. "Why didn't my father mention you before?" This question finally wiped the smile off her face. She sighed heavily before telling me the whole story. "You know, your father and I were close when we were kids. I always looked up to my big brother and would do everything I could to spend time with him. My life as a child was ideal. My parents were loving and the community was friendly. My dad was a local pastor and many in the community idolized him. I guess to a certain extent, we did too." She paused. We never wanted to disappoint him. However, when I was in my early teens, I realized I never wanted to be with a man. I was a lesbian. I really liked this girl, and we started dating in private. Your dad was the first to find out, but promised to keep my secret until I was ready. But he broke his promise. He had told them. Our mom was stunned, and Dad, well, he was furious. He screamed and tried to force me into changing my mind, as if I could. And when they saw that I wasn't going to change, they kicked me out of the house. I wasn't surprised at their actions, but when I looked at my big brother, expecting him to be on my side, he turned away. I was devastated. Our parents could hardly look at me, and my brother backed anything our father said. I left the house, and my girlfriend helped me start a new life. It was the last I heard from my family, until I received this. She pulled out a letter and handed it to me. It was a note from my father. "Dear Kimberly, I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me, and I have no right to ask you to be there for me, but I hope you will consider forgiving me. There's more I would like to say in person, but I'm afraid I wasted too much time. I have a daughter. Her name is Nina. I haven't told her about you, but I would love for you to meet her. Only if you'd be comfortable with it, of course. If I can't see you before the end, I just want you to know that I miss you, love you, and I am truly sorry. With love, Thomas." I looked up from the paper and saw tears in her eyes. It was nice to know that he didn't hate me, but I still have lots of mixed feelings towards him. I am trying hard to find forgiveness in my heart, but it's not that simple. At that point, things began to make sense, but I couldn't be mad at her. She was obviously angry with my father for a good reason, and she never got any closure. I reached out, grabbed her hand, and assured her that I'd be there from now on, because she was my family, and I was beyond happy to meet her and to finally know my family secret. Did you like my story? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel.